Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, John Dehlin. It's May 14th, 2019. We are joined today, as always, by
Margi Dehlin. Hello, everyone.
Thanks for joining us, Margi. It's good to have you.
Thank you for joining us, John.
You are wonderful.
So are you.
And brilliant.
Thank you.
And
As
good,
are you.
And good.
Good. I am good.
And we are joined, of course, by our wonderful, fabulous, spectacular, marvelous, wise co-host from Wichita. Why are you holding your nose?
I always giggle a lot during these introductions.
I don't know why.
Does that mean you don't think they're sincere?
No, I actually think they're very sincere and they're very lovely. And it's probably some reflection on me needing to be able to accept compliments better. And it's kind of like a go-to way that we do this. So it's lovely, John. You do a lovely job because
there is no problem here. There is no problem.
Brilliant and amazing and savvy and witty.
Ooh, I like savvy.
How about tenacious? Can I be tenacious today?
You're tenacious.
Well, it's good to have you. We are doing this episode, or this series of episodes, as a joint release with Mormon Stories Podcast. As many of you know, the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis has come under the Open Stories Foundation Board of Directors and the nonprofit. And we're really excited about that. And so we're able to do more joint episodes with Mormon Stories Podcast and other podcasts like Mormon Mental Health Podcast, because oftentimes there are topics that are shared amongst our audiences. So we're thrilled about that. This is a continuation of a couple hours that we recorded last week. And we have so much to cover on parenting after a Mormon faith crisis that we're going to continue the discussion today. You're going to get 3 or 4 at least really good hours. And this episode is going to spawn other sub-episodes. There's so many topics that are so big, for example, like raising kids in a mixed faith marriage, that we just decided to punt those and cover them in a totally separate series. But welcome to you all. Really quickly, let us make sure and get to the most important beginning, which is discussing our mission. Natasha, do you want to lay that out for us?
Yes, our mission, except for I'm always so involved in sharing all of these things on my things that then I totally forget where we're going. But our mission is the 3 Ps. So help me, because I'm doing a mind blank. So
Margi, you're doing the 3 Ps today.
Okay. So,
I do know that there are 3 Ps. Woohoo!
Woo!
My brain is working at that level today.
We've got positive, we've got personal, and we have the practical. The 3 Ps.
And what are we trying to do with those things?
We are providing, hopefully, some personal strategies and tips for navigating a Mormon faith crisis, while also hoping to help those who are in relationships with those in a faith crisis understand and be able to support.
So our intent is to be believer-friendly and non-believer friendly, church-friendly and non-church friendly, to try and build bridges. That's our goal. And our sub-message is that this whole faith crisis thing feels sometimes at first like a crisis, but it can go like a caterpillar from a chrysalis to a beautiful butterfly, from lemons to lemonade, if you are willing to engage the process and find the right tips and tricks and tools and guides along the way. And we want to help be some of your guides, along with our wonderful listeners who are usually joining us, many of them live on Facebook.
And are so wise.
And are wise and give us good ideas and tips and tricks and suggestions and questions of their own. Really quickly, all of us do have coaching practices that are burgeoning, but we still like to advertise it just because we want to make sure if anybody's really in need now or in 2 years or 5 years, they have somewhere to turn, because sometimes it's just hard to find resources and support. And we are firm believers. We are firm utilizers of therapy and coaching. At least Margi and I are. Natasha Do we even want to put you on the spotlight to find out if
No,
you?
I do get my own help too.
All
I think
right.
that's good practice.
Then we are not only utilizers of coaching and therapy, we are also providers of faith crisis coaching, and in Natasha's case, actual clinical therapy, marriage and family therapy, sex therapy, etc. But Natasha, tell us really quickly about your practice for those who want to know what you do.
Well, you can find out anything you want to know about my practice on natashaparker.org. I'm a clinical licensed marriage and family therapist, have been for over 20 years. About almost 10 years ago now, I went down the road of sex therapy certification. And so definitely involved in that part of the field as well. I do online work and in-office work. So regardless of where you're at geographically, I can probably either see you professionally or at least provide you with directions on where to go. And my online practice name is Symmetry Solutions. So that's me. You can find all of that on natashaparker.org.
Beautiful.
Great. I have people tell me every week that Natasha saved their life and or their marriage. So she's good.
Well, thank you. Goodness, that's a nice thing to say.
I hear it all the
True.
time. I can't escape it, no matter how hard I try. Everybody's pursuing me to tell me
Everywhere he goes.
everywhere I go. Margi, tell us about your wonderful practice.
Yes. So, all things Margi, I'll just direct you to beautyinthenow.org. I have a coaching tab there, but you can also, my blog, I tend to write about the things that I coach about. So that's a way also to kind of see what I do. And you can come visit me there.
All right. I do have a coaching practice at johndehlin.com/coaching. I specialize in faith crisis stuff and mixed faith marriages. Specifically, I love helping save and improve mixed faith marriages. It's kind of my favorite jam, but I'll also do individual stuff as needed. All right. So with that, it is time to move to the What's Working section. And I mentioned this last week, but I'm going to list as my What's Working a video game called League of Legends. And I already, again, have talked about this in previous sessions, but Margi and I sometimes were frustrated at video game usage in this generation, but sometimes we're like, hey, Winston, we want to spend time with you, but you're on a video game. And I broke myself down and said, shoot, I used to love video games. Why don't I just play video games with my son and have that be a way we spend time together? Like, are video games any less virtuous than a board game? Like, in fact, they're in some ways more advanced and more sophisticated. And so I'm learning League of Legends, which is a really complicated game that I'm awful at, but I'm spending good time with my son and I'm already seeing good dividends from that. So that's my What's Working.
Yeah, it's really helped build connection, I feel like, with Win. And I love that Winston's teaching you something. I just think that's lovely. He's
super engaged, like, come on, Dad, you can do better. And it's a nice role reversal. It's like, it's okay, Dad. Even though you're awful, I believe in you, So it's been good. What's working for you, Natasha?
So 2 things I'm going to mention. One is just cherry tomatoes. It's that time of the year where I just love to pop cherry tomatoes, and it's better than potato chips, so I love them. And so this is, I'm not sure if it's a what's working thing, but it's something that I guess worked for me this week because it was super nice. I think, we oftentimes come at ourselves from a self-deprecation lens. It's hard to we're always overwhelmed or thinking about what we could be doing or should be doing. And, the shitting on ourselves is kind of a classic problem I think many of us can commiserate with. So for Mother's Day, my kids kind of went around the table and decided to tell me something nice about me, which, since we're on the topic of parenting, I really try very hard to have good boundaries. Like, my job as a parent is one way, I support, and if they want to give me accolades or be nice to me, that's fine. And there's a certain level of respect that obviously needs to be there. But I'm not looking, I try to be very mindful that I'm not looking for my own self-esteem or my own, processing through my kids, that that's not their job to take care of me. So this was kind of, they did this on their own to come up with something that they liked about me. And 3 of them, it's like, well, she's nice. She's kind of simple things, which were nice to hear. So that was good. But my daughter in particular, who's now an adult herself, really kind of went off on just, we need to understand how hard mom has worked to build her own business, and how hard it is to be an entrepreneur, and how difficult it is to manage all of us in that process. And she does all these different things, and she's constantly worried. I can tell she's worried about things a lot, but she doesn't bring that to us, and does, like, she's fairly upbeat with us and our family. She just went off for like 5 or 7 minutes, talking about, and all the kids and Andy were nodding their heads. And so it was a really nice working for me moment, because it helped me, first of all, get some positive regard from my child, which is always a nice perk to parenting when that happens. It doesn't always happen, and sometimes it never happens, but it's nice when it does. And secondly, it was nice to see, even though I think balancing mothering and career and all that stuff, and that's a whole nother issue, in faith transitions, but that's been a hard thing for me my whole life. It was nice to see my daughter in particular kind of talk about that particular topic in the way that she did. So that's what's working for me.
Beautiful.
I love that.
Do you grow your own cherry tomatoes, or do you buy them at the store, or both?
No, I'm lame with the gardening. I tried back in my more
Us too.
Trying to do the checklist.
That was a should for such a long time.
Yeah.
We had to wish gardening well. We had to wish gardening well for other people.
That's right. Now we support.
And I have garden envy, like anytime people are good at it or love, and I kind of love the idea of it. And then the doing, yeah, I'm lame.
Me too. Yeah.
What's working for you?
So let's see. I feel like all the kind of normal things of what's working, like meditation is working, but I thought I would go in a different direction this week for what's working. So what is working this week for me is this conceptualizing little blocks of time, like 15 or 20 minutes, and doing a bit of organizing. So like oftentimes with organizing, I find, you can have a big project like your kitchen or something. And basically that never happens, or it takes so long, because when do you have, the 2 hours or 4 hours to really attack the entire kitchen? So what has been working is with 15 or 20 minutes, I can organize a drawer in the kitchen. I can organize my sock drawer. I can organize our filing system and I am moving around the house. I mean, things are getting done, and I literally will say 20 minutes. So it makes me super efficient. I pick the project carefully, and I'm feeling progress, which is oftentimes something that can stop, the process of organizing. Is just, you can feel very much like it's too big and you just will never get to it. So it's been nice to break it down and to feel like I'm actually moving forward. And it's been really, really fulfilling. So organizing with 15 or 20 minutes and picking those projects really kind of carefully.
Love it.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing your what's working. Listeners, we always love it when you guys share your what's working as well on the Facebook live stream. We don't have any today, so let's jump right into a continuation of our topic, parenting after a faith crisis. We covered a lot of good stuff last week, and we've still got a lot to go. Some of the things we focused on last week included, parental acceptance and understanding that there's no one way, that every child is different, that we need to bring this idea of kids being whole versus kids being incomplete or broken. We talked about perfectionism, parenting without fear. We talked about modeling mediocrity, the importance of structure. And then we did a big old section on connection over control, which comes from the work of Shefali Saybury. We talked some about values and rituals and gratitude and spiritual practice. So go back and listen to those episodes if you haven't. They're really worth listening to. And let's continue and start talking about other things. Natasha, one of the items that you touched on last week, but we want to have you talk about it again, is the Circumflex model. We know that that's an important model for parenting and for marriage and family therapy that you've been trained on. So can you tell us a bit about that and how it helps with parenting?
Sure. So just for anybody to know a little bit what I'm talking about, you can Google Circumflex model, and there's lots of images and charts that come up that help you kind of understand this. It's not horribly complex, and yet we spent, like an entire semester studying this and how it applies to different family systems. But what I like about the model is that it helps you understand kind of your particular system from two different dynamics. One is what's the level of flexibility in the system, and what's the level of cohesion in the system. So flexibility would be, how much structure, how much, rigidity is there in the system. And cohesion is how much is the system organized on the connection in between people. So just to go over some of these really quickly, you've got, on the cohesion part, you've got disengaged. So not a lot of emphasis on family unity or togetherness, a lot of emphasis on individuality. On the other side of that, you've got enmeshed, which is a lot of emphasis on togetherness. In fact, if you don't kind of agree with the system, you can be seen as being disloyal or disrespectful. Not a lot of room for individual kind of processing. So you can see how those are two extremes, and where we probably want to be somewhere in the middle, right? To be in kind of healthier spaces. We want to have some level of cohesion with our family members, and at the same time allow for some level of individuality. On the flexibility scale, you've got chaotic, which is kind of like zero structure, lack of leadership, not necessarily anybody having too many roles in the family, where you have on the other end of that rigid, where you have very strict discipline, very strict ideas about especially behavioral modification, that you have to behave a certain way to be accepted within the system. So again, we're looking at the middle ground being the more healthier spaces to be at, which are considered flexible, which means you lean a little bit more towards less structure, or structured, which means you lean a little bit more towards structure, but they're all considered kind of healthier spheres. So what I like about this model is that it ends up giving you 4 different circles in the middle that are all considered healthy systems. And so again, to our point that you don't have to come up with one way of doing things. You might have a family where there's a little bit more focus on following the rules or discipline or consequences. You might have another family that has less, structure around those things, but still have enough structure to keep things kind of enough structure for the kids to feel like stable in their system, things like that. And all of those can fit into those healthy systems. Then you've got the middle circle, which is kind of like, we're kind of starting to lean into some dysfunction. And then you've got kind of the outer circle, which is, the worst cases of those, those extremes coming together. So I really recommend for people to use this chart and kind of do a self-assessment and do it on several counts. So one is, how do we feel that we're engaging right now with the kids that we have, our immediate family structure? Where would we put ourselves on that graph? I think it's also very interesting to consider, what family system did I come from? So where would I put my family of origin on the graph? And it's also interesting to kind of look at it from a community perspective. So you can put your ward on the graph, right? So I've lived in lots of different wards and stakes because I was a military brat, and I've moved around a lot too as an adult. And there's differences in how these ward communities or state communities, or even geographically where you live, how the church shows up, on these systems. And you can even have a thought process about where the church at large would fall in this graph. So anyway, that's, I think, a nice tool to be able to help you consider some of the strategies that we're talking about, consider some of the structures that you have in place or would like to have in place, how much is too much, how much is not enough, and, you know, create hopefully systems and be part of systems that fall somewhere in that middle trajectory. So that's my very basic 101 introduction to the Circumflex model.
Okay, so I'm finding a lot of different Circumflex models on the internet, but tell me if I'm hearing you right, if I try and summarize. There's cohesion, and you can have sort of like this disengaged family, or let's just say an enmeshed family, right? In terms of how close everyone feels. And you want to strike a balance between being overly enmeshed and completely disengaged. Is that axis one? Is that right?
Yeah, right.
And then second is adaptability, which is sort of either being super rigid or really chaotic. And you can have like this highly structured home or this totally chaotic, disorganized home. You don't want it over rigid or overly chaotic. You want to find a balance between those two. And then the nexus of those two things is sort of a balanced family in terms of its cohesion and its adaptability or, you know, flexibility. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. And, you know, when you think about a lot of things that we complain about in post-Mormon world is that a lot of times people feel like the system was too rigid and it was too enmeshed, meaning that we're the type of system, Mormonism is the type of system that there was too much cost in order to be an individual self. Now, there are people that complain about different kinds of systems, right, where there's not enough emphasis on togetherness, where they felt too isolated, too alone, too left on their own devices, right? So Mormonism in general, I kind of like to tease, is in some ways like an Italian grandmother, right? It's going to be highly offended if you disagree. It's going to not let you come to Sunday dinner if you're behaving in ways that grandma doesn't agree with, right? So that's rigid and too cohesive and meshed, right? Instead of like having, and this is where the whole concept of differentiation skills can be very useful in helping us. It requires differentiation skills to be in the middle of both of those systems, because differentiation is the whole idea of that word means that we are different yet connected. Different yet connected. Not individualized, not, oh, I'm fine on my own. No, there's connection and difference that are able to tolerate one another. And so those are the skills that we develop to be able to stay in the middle of both of those graphs. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Love it.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing. Good stuff.
Yeah, I think it's a great model. I really love it. I love using it with families. I love figuring out where we fall and have people think about it from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
If I think about our family, and Margi, you can tell me if you think this is right or wrong. I think that we have tried to if we err on the side of talking about everything and high emotional connection. I think that's been a real priority for us. And I think mostly because of your leadership, Margi, we're much more structured than we are chaotic. And so if we have ever had to guard against anything, would it be fair to say that it's kind of the rigidly enmeshed? That's what we would need to guard against? Is that fair to say? I'm just trying to apply this assessment to our family.
I would probably say in the earlier years more of that. When I look at Clara and Winston and kind of our schedule and kind of how we do things now with, you know, to me, it feels like it's much more flexible. That structure is for like meals but like bedtimes are now, or what their activities are, or, you know, driving Win to skateboard after dinner with no moment's notice, or, you know what I mean? I feel like I would definitely
You're saying we have a good balance now.
I feel like we're in the balance realm now, but I do feel like probably starting out, and particularly when we were in the church and for our two olders. We were probably more rigidly enmeshed.
And also, I think, with a therapist, with like a psychologist and a coach, and, talking about feelings all the time, I feel like it was such an important thing for us to talk about feelings that we've talked about them so much that I think we've had to realize that sometimes we may have overcorrected in terms of wanting to be there for our kids emotionally, where maybe they've had in adulthood to learn a little bit of self-emotional regulation that they didn't have to learn because we were always hyper there to talk to them about their feelings. Now, again, this isn't about being self-critical. I'm just saying, have at times we had to look at emotional enmeshment to see if we were allowing our kids the space to self-soothe, and find ways to manage their emotional regulation that didn't always involve us. Do you think that's?
I definitely feel, well, and that's coming from a place of wounding. So oftentimes where in your own childhood, maybe there were things that you really would have valued but didn't have, then you cannot overcompensate, right? And when you're not conscious, then that's something that, and we probably overcorrected a little bit there for some years, particularly when suffering starts entering the picture. So yeah, I think it's probably pretty fair to say.
Well, Natasha, where does your family lean off balance, if it ever leans off balance? I'm sure it doesn't, because you're a marriage and family.
Right, because I've got it all figured out. Well, and one thing I want to say, even before I answer that question, that just listening to you brought up for me. She's
been looking at us. She's analyzing us. We're under eye. We're under Natasha's eye.
I welcome it.
Her all-seeing eye.
No, is this idea that, I think different developmental stages also, we do shift sometimes. I think we might be leaning a little more structured when our kids are 5 and 6 years old, versus when our kids are 16 or 17. And hopefully we can adapt to what the system needs, at any given time. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be in one of these quadrants the entire time you're parenting. Or you might shift from a, let's say, structured, connected space to a flexible, connected space just because of a faith transition, for example. Those still fall within those 4 kind of healthy quadrants, right? So by no means am I trying to imply that you should be in one space the whole time. As far as me, I think that I grew up in a home environment where I would say I was a bit enmeshed. I think we leaned a little too much on emotional connection. And if you disagreed or had some type of experience that was, outside of the family norm, that was difficult for my family to tolerate. And I think in some ways, even though my husband comes from kind of a stoic cowboy family, I think that was the same for them. A lot of times we think of enmeshment as emotionally needy, and that's not what enmeshment is. Enmeshment is that we cannot tolerate other people being different than us, and so we kind of have tantrums and fits and get very stern when people are different than us. So that can be a form of enmeshment. So I think that
really quickly, sorry, thanks for educating me a tiny bit. So certainly there's a scenario where family members don't learn to kind of emotionally self-regulate, and they always depend on talking to their parents or other people to kind of cool down, or, I struggle with this myself. That's not enmeshment. And is that codependence? Like, what, is there another word for that? Is there some category that fits in or not?
You're talking about when you're relying on other people to soothe your own difficulties?
Yeah.
Well, that's a whole nother topic. Yeah. But I will say this, I think that sometimes we, especially in American culture, we tend to think we're codependent when in reality, I think we do need relationships to self-soothe. I think in some ways pop culture has kind of pathologized that, and this word codependent, and not that there aren't issues with true codependency, clinical codependency. But if your idea, I think a lot of times the idea is that I need to be able to take care of myself. I need to be able to self-soothe. I need to be able to cope. Kind of like we're an island. And then when I'm able to do that, then I can have a relationship in a healthy way. And I'm constantly telling people that's not how relationships work. And that's not how pack animals work, which is what we are. We grow up in relationship. We require relationship for well-being. And we do better when we have support system. Now, where that can become a problem, where we do need some self-soothing skills, is that our support system isn't 24/7 available to us all the flipping time, right? And so where you run into problems with this is when you have like parents who are way too neglectful, just aren't around at all. And so now the child, these are like attachment issues, right, that you study in psychology, where the child has to over depend on self and kind of distrust the whole world because they were never able to rely on anybody. Or when you get kind of the helicopter parenting approach, right, where you have people that are just never allowing for the child to feel discomfort or have to problem solve or do some of that stuff and kind of glean resiliency on their own. But in general, we do need people around us to soothe ourselves. That's not a bad thing. And that can definitely fall in these connected and separated quadrants that we see in the Circumflex model. But I typically say, okay, so like 80% of the time, 90% of the time, if you use somebody else, okay, you can probably find somebody in your support system who's available to you 80 to 90% of the time, especially if you have a diverse system, right? This is really a problem when you only depend on one person, one main primary person. But if you've got good friends, if you've got a supportive spouse, if you've got some supported extended family, now there's a variety of people that in a time when you need social support, you can count on somebody to show up. But if you're expecting all of that from a spouse, for example, then that's going to be a problem because nobody can be available 24/7, right?
Right.
Got it.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for that. That's really good. All right. Circumflex model. Everyone, please check that out. Oh, Margi.
And get back to what you were saying about your own family.
Yeah, so I think that, in general, probably most of the fights that Andy and I have had are because he leans structured and flexibility and I lean flexible, right? And so he wants to have more accountability and more rules and more consequences all laid out. And I'm more like, do we really need to do all that? And so that's a lot of where our parenting maybe, fighting, or I don't know if fighting is really the word, but, conflicts come up in our different styles. And I think in our general family, I think that we are somewhat in the I don't know if we're in the we, like it's a little leaning more towards I, and I especially feel that now that my kids are teenagers. And I would like it to be more in the I, like I'd still like to feel a little bit more cohesive than I'm feeling with my kids, but they're resisting that. But I don't think that we're enmeshed. I think that that both Andy and I have done pretty good job of not bringing a lot of that enmeshment from our families of origin. And not to say that our families of origin were awful, because we both really have what we would consider good families, that we came from. Yeah. But I think there was just less tolerance for when you didn't adhere to the system, if that makes sense, than what we're trying to provide for our kids.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. All right. Well, let's move to the concept of embodiment, Margi. This is something that Shefali Saberi also talks about. Is that right?
Yeah. So the idea behind embodiment is basically anytime you notice an issue coming up with your children, let's just say always being late, right? So they're never on time, or they're late to school, or that one kind of thing to think about is to reflect first on your relationship yourself with being late. And so that is almost always kind of the first step as you're looking at an ongoing issue, not just something that, because we all are late, but like something that keeps coming up, is to reflect. And this could be the same with like phone use. that before you ever start expecting or communicating something to your child about changing a behavior, you go ahead and you reflect on your own sense of embodiment with the issue at hand. And so that is something that I particularly appreciate. Number one, because I think reflection is always a good space to be in. I think it allows you to, confront the issue or to talk about the issue in a way where you're connected, where you can actually share. There have been times when we're talking about something that I also am struggling with, and I say I'm going to work on it too. And I say, what's difficult for me, and try to connect with what's difficult for them. And it allows for just a deeper connection, a deeper awareness around the issue at hand. It also allows you to have some sense of the environment you're creating. For example, if you're always rushed and you're always late, then that actually creates an environment where that's more apt to be what your children experience, and they're more apt to kind of follow suit or to not have the skill set to kind of follow through on that. So that's the basic idea of embodiment, is just a level of self-reflection that you use that in turn, you're working on healing yourself. One of the big things about Shefali Saybury is that parenting is actually growing ourselves up. It is actually less child focused than traditional parenting modalities. And then also that it allows for us to connect more deeply with our children's experience and, be less judgmental if we struggle with it too.
I have a really hard time with embodiment sometimes, especially with social media, especially because my job is so related to social media. I'll be frustrated that the kids are too much on social media, and that might even be an accurate assessment, but I'll have those feelings. But then I'll want to be on my phone, and I'll say, well, this is work. I need to be doing work, and work's different than just, mindlessly browsing Instagram, which of course is a really disrespectful way to characterize even what they're doing, because in many cases what they're doing is either socially normal or appropriate or maybe even healthy, and who knows. But all I'm saying is it's sometimes I heard as a child, do as I say, not as I do. And I think that's rubbed off on me a little bit. I'm just being honest. And you're grinning.
No, I think it's very common. And I do think it is sort of an operating system of sorts that we can come by naturally, especially when we're unconscious. But, the other thing with that is it kind of checks your expectations, right? I mean, as an adult, if you're having a hard time regulating your own media use, well, you'll probably communicate that, hopefully, in a different way to at least that's the opportunity, and that's what it's about. These are invitations for you to self-reflect, for you to think about your values, and then to kind of reach out to your child in connection as opposed to judgment and control and hypocrisy, asking your child to embody something that you yourself have not figured out. And children sniff that out really, really quickly.
I like all of that. I really like this idea of the fact that we are all still growing up, that we're all growing up together. And I really find it interesting, especially in midlife, the developmental tasks of adults in midlife, juxtaposed with the developmental tasks of teenagers that we're usually raising at midlife, kind of create some room for chaos, because teenagers are kind of becoming more independent, and we're, in a sense, refocusing a lot of our ideas and our thoughts and behaviors even. And so there's a lot of shifting that's happening, when those two developmental stages kind of collide. And so this idea that we're all kind of growing up together, and then the embodiment, meaning that we're not taking this stance of I am expert at all things. I am teacher and mentor of all things. I direct all things. Mm-hmm. That it's more of this idea of I am with you on the journey. I am also working on these things. Mm-hmm. Even with simple things like organizing the home, You know, if you're going to be like yelling from the couch, like everybody get everything cleaned up, or, you know, you're not very good at some of those things yourself, it's less effective of a model usually than being involved in the process, you know, and let's do this as a team, or let's figure it out, or how are we role modeling those kinds of even behavioral aspects, right, that we all would like to see improve in our households, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super hard. I also think it's not just with the social media. For me, it's also emotion regulation, controlling my emotions, my anger, my sadness, my temper. I think that the extent to which I model healthy emotion regulation is just super healthy for the kids, and the extent to which I'm not modeling it myself, how can I expect them to have control of their emotions or manage their emotions better?
Right.
Yeah, and I have a wonderful example of this, if we're going to get vulnerable. So, because I'm so good at emotionally regulating myself. So we just had an incident in our home where a teenage child, I was trying to say, I have a lot of teenage children, so hopefully this doesn't out anybody, but teenage child who happens to be bigger and larger than me, got very angry and came in the front door and just slammed it super hard and broke the frame on our door. Right. And I think that child was a little shocked by kind of having to come to grips with their own strength, their own ability to cause damage. And, and of course my immediate response was like, oh my gosh, like I'm raising an out of control child. I'm raising, like this child that doesn't know how to emotionally regulate. And I go into a little panic mode. And then when I sit back and think about it, I have fairly successfully modeled that as an appropriate way to deal with anger. Now, I happen to be a woman and I happen to not be as strong, as maybe my husband is. But a lot of times my kids have seen me walk to my room, slam the door, and, that's kind of like mom's pissed and she's going to, be in her room for a while, mumbling or whatever I do in the room. So that was a kind of a wake-up call to be able. And so when I talked to my kiddo about this, we did talk about the concerns of that. And as you're growing into a bigger human being, you have to watch what you can physically do and how, appropriate ways to anger. But in that conversation, I owned that. I said, I think, even though it's not an excuse, and just because your parents make mistakes doesn't mean that you now have full-blown reason to make the same mistakes. I do recognize that I have modeled this behavior, and I'm not proud of that, and I need to improve in this particular area of my life. And so it was just part of that kind of recognizing that we're all on this journey together. So I think that's fairly personal.
It is. And
thank you for sharing and disclosing. That's important.
And that's where we all are. I mean, we are, human beings learning and growing. And I think, so much of the authoritarian model, respect is kind of one of those key words, I think, that, can come up around that model. And I think the irony is once as a parent that you begin to own we model that too. I'm going to own my stuff. This is what it looks like. And instead of really going to that place of a lot of, shame, or that's another thing we can model too, is just this idea of what we do when we make mistakes. Do we berate ourselves? Do we really get defeated? Do we, what owning looks like? What, if you've hurt your child, what an apology looks like, and then how to move forward as a resilient being. And that's the thing about parenting, is we're modeling all of that. And our kids get a sense for how I should treat myself as I'm learning and growing and making mistakes. And some of that can come from how we embody that ourselves.
And I don't know if I'm just having this thought out of nowhere, but, we've talked about the Circumflex model. We've talked about embodiment. We haven't really talked about post-faith transition, but I hope that what people are gleaning from this is the reason why we're talking about these things is because, again, on the Circumflex model, I think we've been mainly modeled and meshed and rigid types of structures throughout typical upbringings in Mormonism. I'm not saying all upbringings, but typical. Or even that's how the church sometimes as an entity will treat even adult people, and they're kind of quote unquote parenting of us as, members. And then with this embodiment idea, again, it's not a typical way that I think in classic Mormon or religiously conservative cultures, that there's a lot of room for this. It does tend to be more authoritarian. It tends to be more, do like John was saying, do what I say, don't worry about what I'm doing. You do what I say because I'm the authority figure. So we're bringing up these concepts, not just because we're talking about parenting in general, but because we think these concepts are not necessarily skill sets that we have in general gleaned in Mormon upbringings, if that makes sense. I just had
That's
that
right.
thought.
And another layer is cultural. I mean, we come by it really honestly culturally. Everyone knows what a good child looks like in public, right? Or a naughty child or a disrespectful child. These things, we have many, many layers, and they're cultural, they're in our own families, they're in the church layer as well. So yeah.
Well, and especially here in the United States, I mean, Mormonism is not divorced from the puritanical roots of Christianity. And there's lots of parenting dynamics just from, don't spare the rod, those kinds of ideas that we've been grappling with as a country for a long time, and just parenting dynamics. And there's a lot of research, for example, coming out. Really, the American Pediatric Association has really come out very strongly with some position statements against spanking, So it's something where it affects us from an American culture, it affects us from a Mormon culture, and it affects us as a Christian culture, right? So that's a lot of overlay.
Absolutely.
So we've got a lot of work to do.
Yes, we do.
We've got a lot of rewriting.
Including me stopping slamming doors.
Stop slamming doors, Natasha.
And I usually say a few nice words along
with
that. I'm just going to say. I'm going to work on that. You guys can hold me accountable.
Thank you for sharing that.
Okay. Well, Natasha, you have a point about an intentional approach instead of a programmatic approach. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So I think one of the things that we see, and I'm not the only one who's talked about this, you've talked about this quite a bit too, John, in our co-presentations, is that the church offers a very good program per se. And I like to make the metaphor of like public school versus a homeschooling program, right? So those of us who want to take advantage of the public school system, there's not a lot of that you have to do other than pay your fees and, send your kids off to school. The teachers are there doing the curriculum. There's administrators in place. There's, sports. There's all kinds of systems set up to help your kiddo. For those who maybe want to take a homeschooling approach, well, that takes a lot more time, a lot more energy, a lot more kind of intentionality. And I'm not saying anything pro or against homeschooling versus public school system, but I'm just saying the church kind of does something similar, from nursery on. There's a program in place that if you plug your kid in, they're going to have community, they're going to have curriculum, they're going to have social environment, they're going to have activities, they're going to have and they're going to have expectations that go along with that of what comes next, and all the way up to mission and temple marriage and ongoing service in the church community as an adult. So it's ready-made, it's autopilot type stuff. Yeah. So for those of us who are transitioning away or don't want that to have such an influence, even just nuanced Mormons or things of that nature, you really have to start intentionally either creating something completely different or finding other systems to plug your kids into if you're going to leave. Or if you're going to stay kind of in a nuanced approach, you have to really understand the curriculum, understand what's being said, and create a lot of stuff on your own that addresses things that you're uncomfortable with or that you want to give a different perspective on. So I think that this is a helpful metaphor in just owning the work, owning the work, that if you want to create, if you don't like what the church has provided, or you want to step away from what the church has provided, you either have to create something different or be okay with there not being a spiritual program necessarily. It doesn't mean that you leave and you have to create something that's similar to what the church had. But you may want to create something in the sense of service projects or volunteer work or community. How are your kids going to get some of the things that they got in the Mormon church outside of the Mormon church? So that's something that I think is worth talking about a little bit.
So, you know what? Probably half of all the comments we've received from our listeners are around this issue. So let's dive into this, and this may take a good 30 minutes of time, but I think it's worth it.
Let's do it.
So, so basically, this reminds me of the workshops that we do in the retreats, because, we talk about all the holes that Mormonism fills. Mormonism fills spirituality hole, your moral, it meets your moral needs, it meets your community needs, it resolves your concerns about death and the afterlife, it provides you with community, it has and social and friends, it's a support for parenting and family. Like, there's so many needs that Mormonism provides. It's almost like a public school. You just literally drop your kids off and come back in 6 hours, and they may not have the best education in the world, but they've got, at least a solid framework. And Richard Rohr, we've mentioned him a lot. He talks about this. He talks about first half of life and second half of life, that you need to have some structure that you're raised in to then allow you to have a faith crisis in whatever structure that is, to then allow you to construct a life of whatever you want it to be. But if you don't have a certain socioeconomic level, a certain education, a certain moral structure, discipline, work ethic, and ego, as he calls it, you aren't able to even have the luxury of getting to the phase of having a faith crisis, so that then you can make life exactly what you want. Because if you're just stuck making ends meet, working minimum wage, working 3 jobs, just trying to survive, you're not going to have the luxury of a faith crisis to then build a life that's to your liking. You may not have the monetary or the social resources, or the mental health or the physical health resources to even allow you to construct a life of your own choosing. And so one of the questions that people asked, and I think this is super relevant for a faith crisis, is what if I'm no longer a believing Mormon, but I want to raise my kids in, and we'll take as the first option, a Mormon church, not because it's true, not because I like everything about it, but just because it provides a lot of those structural elements. And one wise listener wrote, it provides them something to rebel against. So what do you guys think about this idea of intentionally raising them Mormon, not because you believe in it, but because it provides so much? And once they're to the point of rebellion, hopefully they rebel in a more progressive, liberal, even secular direction. Margi, you look skeptical. And Natasha, you're giggling. So I want to know, Margi, what's your skepticism about? And then Natasha, what's your giggling about?
Awesome.
It would help to kind of know the ages maybe that we're talking about. As kids kind of get older, I like the idea of children being part of that process for themselves, that it is a decision. Things become invitations and they can kind of decide a little bit. Yes, the answer is absolutely. I feel like it is possible to have children grow up in the Mormon church and, be able to independently think, be able to kind of think things through, be able to discern. And I think it starts with a lot of the things we've been talking about. So this is something that pairs well, whether you're still going to church or you're not at all. And so I go back to the full container approach, which means kids come with a desire to discern goodness, with a desire filled with kind of light, and are, you know, as parents, we love to create opportunities where they get to feel that, they're in touch with that. But so something really common that I talk about when it comes to going to church and differentiation, again, is this idea when they get home, when you're having an evening meal, that you start asking questions that allow for your children to connect with themselves. That if, as parents, you feel differently, you emulate differences with a real positive sense of regard and love for one another. That it allows for you to practice creating environments where your children are reflecting on things that they're hearing, not just to blindly accept, but to think over, to mull over and decide for themselves. And the way you begin by doing that, you begin to do that is just simple questions, and then, you know, creating environments where it is very clear that everyone is respected at the table for their opinions, and that this is an unconditional love paradigm where everyone is welcome and valued, and there's this expectation that we likely will feel differently on, you know, different from topic to topic. So that's just one sort of, I love it being a perk. If Richard Rohr is saying, hey, here's a perk of growing up in a structure, it's that later on you get to have something to rebel against. But I don't find that as something that is essential for everyone. I feel like there are many wise, beautiful people who find wise, beautiful lives that are fulfilling to them without ever having a religious structure to begin with. So I just like looking at, oh, here's something that's a perk if you happen to have grown up in organized religion. Here's something to think about. So those are some of my basic thoughts.
So thank you. Natasha, before you answer, I'm going to read Krista's comment because it's really thoughtful. She says, after I left the church, the Mormon church, I found a lot of comfort and validation reading Richard Rohr's Falling Upward, but it suggested something that left me questioning my decisions regarding my young family's relationship with religion. He basically suggested, or maybe I just understood, that kids need the structure and belief system that religion offers so that one day they have a system to kick against to go through their own spiritual awakening. It got me thinking that without my upbringing in the church and all the cognitive dissonance I'd wrestled with my whole life, I might not have come to find my soul the way I have through leaving the church. I get Marty's laughing. Leaving the church. Let's see, I missed it. What if they need something to rebel against to come to their second journey? If we were feeling like our family would continue without religion, but I'm wondering if there might be wisdom here I may have overlooked. So Natasha, what is your response to Krista's question about raising kids Mormon as non-believers? What do you think?
Well, I really like, I think what's at the bottom of Margi's statement, which is there's no need, there's nothing saying that you have to have a certain type of structure. The concept that people are going to at some point kick against whatever structure they are offered is somewhat developmentally correct. But again, these words that we kind of typically tend to think of as rebelling, you know, we think about rebelling being something super dramatic, like, I don't know, going against every single rule that the system presents, or there's lots of ways to kick against a system just by having critical thinking and thinking a little bit differently than something. It doesn't mean that you're going off and, you know, having huge behavioral issues or something along those lines. So I do think that younger kids require structure, some level of structure, not rigid structure, hopefully flexible structure, going back to the Circumflex model. And as kids hopefully go through the developmental stages, we become a little bit more flexible as they grow into teenagerhood. But that doesn't mean that they require religious structure. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they require belief structure, that those things can be shifting and changing, because kids also require flexibility, right? In other words, they have to be able to understand that life is flexible and that things change and things of that nature. So I think that raising your kids in a system that you don't believe in just because it offers structure is a little bit missing the point. You want to hopefully, give your kids structure that does fall in line with your values and your belief systems and things of that nature. That's what most of us do. And Mormonism isn't the only place that you can find community structure. Mormonism does that well, but so do other communities, and so do other non-religious communities. So it's more about finding something that fits your particular aspect as an adult, and then of course being flexible with that as kids maybe come into their own systems that they want to be a part of. Now, when you're in a mixed faith relationship, which I know we're going to talk about later, or when you're in a nuanced space and you still want to engage in Mormonism, then I think, yes, you can glean from some of the benefits of Mormon structure. And you want to be intentional in making sure that you're also offering them lots of other ideas that do mirror your beliefs and your values as the parent, that you don't just allow for this system to take over and to downplay your authority. And so in mixed faith parenting, that can be a little bit of a challenge on knowing how to do that, but we have good strategies that we'll talk about at a later date on that.